What's up, guys? Death Battle just put out their Hulk Godzilla video, which I was very excited to watch, and I wanted to make a video talking about it. The debunked here is kind of like a little bit of a clickbait. Like it's not. I think that they did like a pretty good job, and it's something I do want to talk about. And there's like some small grips I have with it, but generally, I do like the content Death Battle puts out. And even though I disagree with them sometimes, I'm never here to like you know talk smack about them or like horribly like drag them through. Like I think that they do a pretty good job, and I think that a lot of like the hate they get is very like overblown. Especially like with this debate community stuff. You can really convincingly make an argument for either one just because there's so much media that you have for each character. They vary so much. And like you can kind of, even if you're like perfectly well intentioned, like kind of cherry pick for one side or the other. It's hard to be perfectly fair to both sides, even if you have the best intentions. That being said, let's just go ahead and get started. One thing I wanted to start off with was, I wanted to say, I think Death Battle did a pretty good job. I liked that they took a step away from the stat stacking that they often like used to do in their videos, where they take a number and they apply multipliers, or they'll calculate like how much force is required for a specific feat, because that kind of stuff can be a little weird. It can feel like a little nitpicky at times when you're picking one feat from a character. And some people might say like, oh well, you can't pick that. The author wouldn't have intended for like that level of you know output for the power. It was just like an accident, especially when it comes around like black hole stuff. But whatever, right? Um, so that was like something that like I really approved of. They took a step away from it, and they kind of, it felt like, just kind of took a step away from that and kind of just took the general scaling that's applied to both and said like, these are both multiversal characters. Let's not worry about you know calculating how strong the feats are. We have a general consumption for how strong they are, which is in both of their cases like kind of beyond the strength that their verse is limited to, right? And in addition to that, I also really liked the fight and the way that it like turned out. I think that the whole ending of Bruce Banner, using his like scientific brain to figure out a way around the like the Godzilla like reality warping particles was like, that was a pretty creative solution, right? Obviously, when it comes to like a specific outcome, when we have like a death battle that we're talking about, like who would win, we wouldn't like assume that a character can just walk away from the fight, like prep and then come back to it, right? But like it doesn't really matter in the context of like their like little fan animation, because it was just like a fun thing that they talked about, and it was like a creative solution. I like that. I thought it was pretty good, right? Would that always be the case when you're talking about a Hulk versus Godzilla fight? Like obviously not, but it was like a fun solution to the fight that they came up with, and I really appreciated it. That being said, to talk about my thoughts on this debate in this battle, I think that like first of all, I'm gonna talk about both Hulk and Godzilla in terms of how they scale. Generally, in terms of like abilities and power, like raw power. Speed, I don't think is as important. And just like to, I guess, like briefly glaze over it, Hulk and Godzilla have both fought characters who are faster than light. Godzilla has fought like Gigan and the likes. I think you could probably also get like Space Godzilla to like faster than light speeds because of like his weird black hole feats and stuff. Hulk is also definitely faster than light in terms of reaction, who he's capable of fighting. But you could probably get him to massively faster just through like scaling. He can fight the likes of Thor, etc. That being said, I don't think speed is that big of a factor in this fight specifically. Even if the Hulk is faster, the Hulk is not the kind of person to like hit a flash step in the middle of a fight to dodge an attack, right? Like we don't see him do that. He kind of doesn't really even dodge attacks for the most part, especially when he's not like one of the smarter incarnations of the Hulk. Like when he's like kind of like the mindless or like childlike Hulk, he kind of just goes all out and doesn't really like concern about using his speed to to dodge attacks, right? Maybe you can make an argument that he would try to avoid an atomic breath, but like I kind of don't think he would. He seems like the kind of character to just kind of jump straight, and then so in terms of speed, I'm going to put them roughly equal. And then in terms of power, let's go ahead and talk about it. One thing to note is that the Godzilla version that they used seemed to be kind of a composite version of Godzilla, right? Like it appeared to be a Heisei version of Godzilla at the beginning, and then it transformed into Ultima. They talked about Heisei feats, Ultima feats, Showa feats, so it felt like they were kind of doing a composite of the Godzilla from the different movies, which I think is reasonable. But it's a little weird because the Godzilla versions are like different characters. They're not like a stream of continuity that gets you from one to the other. But typically with superheroes, we also do that where we just take composite versions between different storylines. So I think that this was like a fair way to do it. Pretty cool too to see Ultima come out. So generally, I will say that like let's go ahead and talk about the different versions of Godzilla, what they bring to the table, and then kind of use that to get an idea of what a composite Godzilla would look like and try to use that for the debate, right? So Heisei Godzilla, the main scaling that I've seen like people get through Heisei or to Heisei Godzilla is through Space Godzilla, who along with all the other feats that are like thrown around with Heisei, if you take it all on face value and you trust like the not developers but the people behind the projects and what they say, you can get Godzilla to some pretty like crazy like levels of strength in the Heisei era. Comfortably Universal Plus, and then you can make arguments to multiversal. I think mostly based on the fact that Space Godzilla is kind of like transcendent, um, or like beyond the realm of like normal. What do you call it? Like three dimensions, right? Like he's like multidimensional because he can control black holes. He has control over gravity. That kind of stuff is kind of generally how you would go about doing the Heisei scaling. I'm not going to fully go over it. I'm just gonna give you guys like an idea as to what like I think the consensus is on Godzilla, and then if you guys want like a very elaborate form of scaling, then there are plenty of people on YouTube that do like a much better job than I could in a short little video, right? So generally, this like scaling through Space Godzilla's like powers, I think they call it super gravity specifically, gets him to like multi-dimensional levels of power, which generally you can kind of scale a character. If you can scale a character to that, you can scale them Universal Plus at least, right? And then Heisei Godzilla does get stronger later on, so people like apply those like those buffs, especially like Burning Heisei Godzilla is kind of the one that people agree is multiversal plus. I wouldn't go quite that far. I think that if Godzilla was like fully multiversal plus with like his atomic breath, then like why he like especially Heisei Godzilla is like pretty evil. Like why would he not blow up the planet if he wanted to? It's just like in that sense like common sense, but like also I understand because when you have the creators come out and say like, oh, this version of the character is capable of destroying the universe, like you do with Desghidorah, then obviously everything that scales up from it has to be more powerful, and then you're like, I can't like who are we to say that the author is wrong about their own material, right? So it's a bit of a gray area, especially with a character like Godzilla. But I'd say you can get him anywhere from building level if you're being very conservative to universal plus multiversal if you're being a little more lenient with it. Again, like the super gravity is like a big part of the scaling. It is just like a lot of I think it was confirmed too that Space Godzilla like was able to survive black holes and like strong gravity fields. So like that kind of stuff can like up the scaling by like a pretty substantive degree. Don't think that's how you use substantive, but and then Ultimate Godzilla is kind of a beast of his own. A big part of like Ultima Godzilla and a lot of Godzilla forms in general is like he is like so difficult to deal with just in general. And they did talk about this like pretty in depth in the Death Battle video. But Ultima Godzilla does have the power to kind of bend reality to a certain extent. Like it required the team to do their little fancy smancy anime math calculations or whatever in order to like overwrite that power of Godzilla. Otherwise, he was like relatively impervious to like being damaged or attacked, which again they covered pretty well in the Death Battle video. So I don't feel it necessary to really go in like incredible detail here. But the point is, if we're using a composite version of Godzilla where he has access to this power, that's like a pretty big hurdle for most characters that don't have reality warping, right? Because like he can more or less nullify damage again in the way that they described it in the Death Battle video. So that's like a pretty big hurdle to overcome. Then we also have Godzilla Earth. Godzilla Earth's main claim to fame is that he's able to fight against an entity known as Void Ghidorah, which is a version of King Ghidorah that kind of exists across multiple realities, which I think is more or less interchangeable with multiple universes, right? I don't think that's like so unreasonable to say. And he's capable of fighting against this extra dimensional being, injuring him, and eventually beating him. Although I don't think he quite killed him. I think it was more like he severed his connection to the the plane or whatever it was, right? But the point is, Earth Godzilla is able to fight against Void Ghidorah, able to tank attacks, and generally like fight against him pretty well, right? And so I think if you're using like that kind of scaling, that's also another argument for like universal plus to multiversal levels for Godzilla Earth or Godzilla in general, rather. Then you also have Shin Godzilla, which, along with Ultima, has like a very interesting form of durability. Uh, and when I say that, also like it's not just durability. Like he's obviously very durable. It was like almost impossible for him to be killed in the movie until they eventually froze him. But he has like a very adaptive power where over time he just grows in power, right? And so where we saw the Shin Godzilla movie end was at the, I believe, fifth form. I'm thinking, yeah, fifth or maybe sixth form. I think it depends on how you like number them. But the point is, he stopped at like one of those numbers, and we didn't get to see like the full extent of his evolution because he was killed, or at least that's where the movie ended, right? But in the original script, and so like, based on that, it's up to you on terms of like how much you want to count it as canon. But like personally, I think that like we didn't see his full potential, so we can kind of assume that that form, like the form 8 that we get in like the director's notes, is like a logical extreme of where he could have gone if he kept adapting. But basically, he was like a god level universal controlling like entity by the end, like completely beyond the realm of comprehension of what he was at the very beginning. Like he just kept adapting and eventually became, again, like omnipotent, like godlike in his powers. And so, like, again, if we're using a composite version where he also gets like Shin Godzilla levels of adaptability, it again becomes pretty ridiculous because like what a ridiculous ability, right? You just get constantly stronger, and then if you like kind of adapt that on top of the whole already multiversal level stuff, things can get a little weird, which is why like these composite versions of characters are a little weird, and also probably why in Death Battle they didn't mention Shin Godzilla, because it just would have been so strange too, right? Like he starts off much weaker than the other Godzillas, but by the end he's like probably one of the stronger forms of Shin Godzilla, or sorry, of Godzilla in general. So it's like a little weird to include him for that reason, but worth talking about because it does speak to like the different variation of Godzilla and like their incredible durability. Really, with this version of Godzilla, there's really not much you could do to kill him because he would just regenerate it back. Hence why they had to like freeze him in the movies. And so with Hulk, again, like I'm not going to talk too much about it because I think generally most people probably have a pretty clear idea as to how strong the Hulk is. The strongest hero there is like a part of his title. Recently capable of fighting against an immortal Thor, and immortal Thor, of course, having the Thor Force, which is the same as the Odin Force, which powers Odin. And I think that kind of also goes without saying, but just to go over it quickly, Odin is capable of fighting against cosmic level beings like Galactus, who are pretty easily multiversal in their own scaling. Thor, when he was born, was able to shake the Yggdrasil, which, depending on who you are, maybe like different levels of impressive. Yggdrasil was at the very least universal level. Some people think it's multiversal and that it connects all the different multiverses. Some people say that each universe has its own Yggdrasil. Hard to say. I think that in the past, I used to think it was a multiversal thing, but I do think it probably makes more sense that the nine realms exist within one universe. Um, Otherwise, like because Odin is the king of the nine realms, and presumably different versions of Odin exist across the multiverse. But whatever, it's neither here nor there. You can still get to multiversal other ways. Most easily, Odin force Thor is able to fight against Null. Null, of course, killing Celestials, and Celestials being the creators of the multiverse. Pretty easy scaling to get Thor to multiversal, and by extension, Hulk. Excuse me. That being said, like I think that they were kind of fair in terms of like how they went about comparing the characters, where like they're both arbitrarily infinitely powerful and arbitrarily infinitely immortal. And then they did go on to say, like, if you compare the cosmology of Marvel to the cosmology of Godzilla, you will find that Marvel is like more impressive. Excuse me. And so, I think that this is a little unfair, though. And not to say it's untrue. Nothing they said with that was incorrect. But, it just, when you compare cosmologies like this, it feels a little unfair to smaller franchises. And not to say Godzilla's like small by any degree, right? But like we're comparing 27,000 comics to like 38 movies, and some other source material for the Godzilla stuff. But generally, that's going to favor whoever has the more expansive stuff, because as you have a longer run, things you have just like crazy statements thrown out every now and then, and so like if you have one run of X-Men where everybody's an Omega level mutant, and then after that run ends, everything goes back to kind of like relative normalcy. People are still going to be scaling those Omega level mutants as strong as they were in that one specific run, right? Like we see that with Iceman, right? Like he was very like particularly strong in one run of X-Men where he was an Omega level mutant. He had the ability to control like all atmospheric moisture. I think this was when he was being controlled by Emma Frost, to be clear. But like same difference. Like after that, when people talk about Iceman, it's not necessarily what he normally does, it's what he could theoretically do. Which is why I do think that when it comes to talking about characters, it makes more sense to kind of take a reasonable middle ground in terms of, just how strong the characters are. So that you're not like, taking the absolute strongest feat for a character who is like normally street level, right? Like if you take Spider-Man's absolute strongest feat, you could probably scale him like in terms of power to being able to knock out characters like the Hulk. But like on average, if you throw a car at Spider-Man, it's gonna hurt him, right? So I don't know. That's a point of contention, but there's no right answer for that. And I apologize too for the coughing. I try to do this in one take, and like there's nothing I can really do about my cough. I just am coming off of a cold, so I'm sorry if that bothers you. So now, in terms of like who I would say is stronger between the two, if you're going based on like scaling the dimensions and like the size of the cosmologies, Hulk has to take it, and by that logic, like has to take a fight pretty easily. Um, Otherwise, if you're being like a little more reasonable about it and saying like, okay, they're both like on top of their cosmology, able to affect like infinite space, they're like roughly equal. The fight's I think a little more interesting to talk about, because then it also comes down to like their specific abilities. And so, again, I do like the way that they go with the fight, where they kind of use like Bruce Banner's like intelligence as a way for him to defeat Godzilla's niche powers. And I think like within verse that makes sense. Bruce Banner's an incredibly smart guy. If anybody was able to do it, it would be him or Reed Richards, right? So like that line of logic was okay, but I think when it comes to a fight like this, we are assuming like they're just going at each other. Nobody's given access to prep time. Not that Godzilla would do anything with it anyway. So like even though I don't disagree with Death Battle's assertion there, that's not what I'm going to talk about with these fights. And so that being said, and getting towards the end of the video here, I just want to talk about like a few different like cases of Godzilla versus Hulk and where I would stand on it. And then ultimately we'll end on composite versus composite. I'll give you my thoughts, but ultimately, most of this stuff can kind of go either way. So, Heisei Godzilla versus a more like normal base Hulk. I think that this one does depend on how you scale the cosmologies. If you care about cosmology scaling, Hulk has to take this no contest. If you're like willing to say like, oh, maybe cosmology is like a little silly to go off of, and we're just going to compare like their average powers and like average showings, then I think it probably still leans a little bit towards the Hulk, but it's hard to say, right? Like the thing about the Hulk is on his like his absolute like like after like a little bit of fighting, he's going to get to planetary level. But if you start the Hulk in like a very normal state and he's not angered, he is not quite at that level yet, right? But that being said, a fight versus Godzilla is going to go on a long time between these two. And frankly, I don't think even Heisei Godzilla on average has the AP to really be able to like fully kill the Hulk, because Hulk has like a pretty impressive amount of regeneration. Although I do think that Godzilla probably starts off stronger than the Hulk, right? Like even to get Hulk to like multiversal on average, like World Breaker Hulk, right? He needs to be like sufficiently angry. And World Breaker Hulk got to that point like not over the course of a fight. Right? He got that angry when he was sent to another planet, his like the plane exploded, killed his family, whatever it was, right? So hard to say that like Hulk is, on average like multiversal or even universal plus. He needs to get to that point. But the question is like, would Godzilla let him get to that point? And then that comes down to, do you think Godzilla is actually universal plus, just like in base form? Do you think that's just how he is? And if you go on statements, then yes, he is. And in that case, I think that Godzilla probably does win the fight because his atomic breath should be able to like kind of like fully erase Hulk if it's that powerful. But again, I think if you're going with like a more reasonable assertion for like Heisei Godzilla, then Hulk is probably taking it just on account of having the durability and then eventually having the strength to take him out. Um, Now, in terms of that base Hulk versus Shin Godzilla, it becomes a little more interesting because this one just becomes like a straight slugfest where Shin Godzilla can't kill Hulk at first because he's not strong enough. It doesn't have like the AP to, and then Hulk can't really beat Shin Godzilla because Shin Godzilla's like regeneration is so overpowered. And like even like ripping off his head kind of wouldn't like necessarily kill him. So what that comes down to is, who wins in the long run for having a prolonged fight. And while the Hulk does get infinitely like strong, Shin Godzilla like his powers adapt in like a different way, where he not only gets like stronger in terms of like his AP and his strength, but he also like gets access to new abilities. And then if you're willing to go with like, the director's notes for the logical extreme of how strong Shin Godzilla could have gotten, then Shin Godzilla like eventually just like ascends and becomes a god, and then like what can Hulk do in that situation, right? So on average, again, on this one, I would give it to Shin Godzilla, but arguments can kind of go either way on this one as well. Now, this is where we're going to start to talk about like stronger versions of these characters, where we have Ultima Godzilla versus Worldbreaker Hulk. Now, the weird thing about this, and the weird thing about Worldbreaker Hulk in general, is that like if you look at his scaling and like what he's able to accomplish within Worldbreaker Hulk, he is like like a universal plus level of character, and this is like still coming after the fact that this is like you know a version of Hulk that is like as strong as he could get, right? But and yet like normal base Hulk feats do sometimes beat like Worldbreaker Hulk feats, which is why it's so strange to even like talk about this character in my opinion, because like obviously he's logically stronger than base Hulk, but even like in terms of his showings outside of like fighting other characters, he's really not more impressive than base Hulk, which is again like it's such a strange like thing to admit, right? But that being said, he's like pretty strong, but not like unlimited in terms of his strength. Very casually able to destroy the planet, no doubt of that. But in terms of like his true upper limit, it's not exactly easy to say. And also, I do know this is World War Hulk, but I do mean to be referring to World Breaker Hulk. And then Godzilla Ultima, obviously like in terms of his strength, he is above I would say Heisei Godzilla. And in terms of like his hacks, he has the access to those particles that kind of overwrite reality. And so a fight between these two is not just like a matter of like how hard can the Hulk hit him, but like the Hulk doesn't really have any ways to kind of bypass that durability negation, right? And then it can come down to like when Worldbreaker Hulk fought against the Juggernaut, who also has like this inability to kind of be killed through physical means. He literally just like threw the Juggernaut into space. Would he be able to do that to Godzilla? Like probably, right? There's no reason why Godzilla like shouldn't be able to be picked up and thrown by the Hulk. He's like certainly strong enough to throw him. But he throws like Godzilla into space, and there's really no way for Godzilla to get back, right? Kind of a misconception with this kind of stuff. Like even like with the whole atomic breath stuff, Ultima Godzilla should not be able to return to Earth from space, right? Because there's nothing to push off of in space, even if he fires his atomic breath. At least to my understanding. So that is like a win scenario for Worldbreaker Hulk, but like, and that's not like out of character too, right? Worldbreaker Hulk is like a little smarter, so like he'll like assess like if a fight's gonna take too long or if it's like unfeasible for him to win through punching, he will throw character into space like he did with Juggernaut. So it's kind of like a weird fight to talk about. And again, I know it's not like a satisfying conclusion to a fight for the person to just sit here and waffle on about how there's so many scenarios you can go one way or another. But I kind of am getting to like a point where my opinion with a lot of these fights is it does just depend on how charitable you're going to be willing to be to both sides. That being said, kind of like taking a step back and talking about what Death Battle is going over, which is like a composite version of both characters fighting each other. And of course, this composite Hulk being like a base Hulk, but like with like overarching Hulk feats, right? I think that I don't disagree with the death battle result on average that Hulk would win. Especially because when you analyze like the cosmology, like Marvel does have that edge, but you know, like with that cosmology difference, even like the difference in Ultima's ability to rewrite like reality kind of feels like it's unimportant because like Hulk literally is like infinite dimensions above Godzilla. So like sure you have reality overriding powers, but like this guy is literally able to like affect realities that are beyond anything you even have access to, right? So in that sense, if you're using like that level of scaling, you're using the cosmologies, Hulk has to take the fight against Godzilla. I think like kind of no contest. But if you're not saying like, oh, Marvel cosmology is just better than yours, because that's like I do think that's like a bit of a cop out. In terms of like discussing a fight, then I think it's like a lot more of an interesting topic. And if you're using a composite version of Godzilla that has at the very least access to like Ultima's reality rewriting, then I actually just don't think the average Hulk is capable of killing that version of Godzilla. But at the same time, is that version of Godzilla capable of killing the Hulk? Is like a lot more contentious, right? Because the Hulk is like so ridiculously regenerative. Like he was able to like revive from even like a skeleton, right? But again, I think that that's like a very high end interpretation of Hulk regeneration, where like we have seen him be killed before by like like brute trauma, and so like to say that he would never ever be able to be killed by something like less than fully atomizing every cell in his body, I think is a bit of a misnomer. Like I think that like on average Hulk is killable by just like enough hits. But the question then becomes like, over time as the Hulk becomes stronger, would he ever be able to overcome like the Godzilla Ultima's, reality warping? And I would say like probably not. I don't know if we had any like showings of the Hulk overcoming somebody's like reality defining in like the in that sense. Obviously he's able to fight against characters who are comparable strength, but it really is just like a brute strength thing at that point, right? And so if you're not giving Hulk the advantage of cosmology, I do think that a composite version of Godzilla wins just purely through having access to so many hacks abilities, right? Like he's able to interact with characters that exist in multiple realities. He's able to rewrite reality. If you're using Shin Godzilla, he's able to like adapt his body to overcome any like trauma, kind of like a doomsday scenario, right? And so without the ability to ever have enough power to actually kill Godzilla, I would say that Godzilla should take that fight comfortably. But again, with cosmology, the Hulk does take the fight. And so I'm not disagreeing with Death Battle in that regard. Although I guess my disagreement would be, Hulk wouldn't even need to rely on his Bruce Banner side to overcome the like reality warping in that case. He's just like so much above the strength of Godzilla at that point that he could literally just like punch him and knock him out and kill him. And alternatively, just throw him into space if he has access to like that level of thought. Now, again, that was a video with a lot of waffling, and I know that that's not something that appeals to the average person, but I think that it's worth like admitting that there's a lot of nuance to these types of death battles, especially these characters that have so many different versions, so many different interpretations that have come out over the years, and like so much variance in terms of their fighting. So I guess to put like a TLDR on it, I disagree with Death Battle's assertion that the fight would go anything less than the Hulk just punching Godzilla and it being over if you're going off cosmology scaling. But if you're willing to admit that cosmology scaling is a little silly and you're willing to give these guys like roughly composite versions with like equal-ish AP, then Godzilla has to take it just through having access to, so many like weird and niche abilities that are just kind of hard for the average brute to overcome. So that's all I've got for it. Again, apologize for the waffling and all the coughing, but I had fun making this video. I had fun talking about this. I personally love the Godzilla franchise, and it's something that I've been really exploring a lot recently. I've recently been watching through all the Godzilla movies as well. So when this video came out, I was very excited to see it. Although Godzilla is not a character I've ever really engaged with in terms of the scaling, this was like my first time doing that. So I learned a lot doing this video, and I had a good time. I hope you guys had a good time too. And, let me know what you thought about the death battle. Maybe you liked it a lot. Maybe you hated it with all your heart and you came here hoping that somebody would dunk on it, but instead you got me just kind of talking about nonsense for 30 minutes. So, whatever is the case, I look forward to reading your replies. So, I hope you guys all have a good day, and I'll catch you in the next one.